Welcome, Whiskey Theologians. This is Around the Word in Many Classes. Today we will be drinking Glendalock Double Barrel. We'll be talking about Exodus and various chapters out of Numbers. So sit back, relax, pour yourself a drink, and let's get into it. I'm really excited about this one. This one's been on my list of whiskeys that I've wanted to try for a long time, for years, in fact. And I finally went ahead and I have it, and I'm really pumped. This is Glendalock Double Barrel. I'm assuming that's how you pronounce this, specifically because I went on the internet and someone who is Irish said it that way. Although that being said, he really did seem unsure of himself, but that's what I'm going with. My guess would have been Glendalough or Glendalough, something like that, but Glendalock, apparently. I don't know why I've been so excited about this one. I never really heard anything about it, but I think it's this guy that's on the label. For some reason, that spoke to me in a way that I can't quite explain myself. It is an Irish whiskey, which this went on my list the first time I kind of took a pass at Irish whiskey. It was shortly after my honeymoon in Dublin. I really got into Irish, and then I kind of moved away from Irish and was more interested in Scotches. And I'm kind of moving back. I've really been enjoying a lot of the Irish whiskeys that I've had recently. And as part of that, I don't know, homecoming, if you will, coming back to the Irish whiskeys, I decided go ahead and get this. By the way, the back of the label says that that guy is Saint Kevin. All it says about him is that he stood apart. No idea what that means. Don't know if he's a real saint or not. If he is a real saint, I'll probably do one of my shorts on him just so that I talk about him. I like talking about the saints. Really, it's a lot of fun. If he's a fake saint, well, this is the last you're going to hear of it. So, there it is. But let's get into trying it. Like I said, it's an Irish double barrel. Started out in bourbon barrels and ended in some fancy kind of sherry barrels. So let's give it a try. Not as much sherry as I would have expected. At least the sherry barrels, don't come across to me the same way that they do in scotches. A lot of scotches are finished in sherry casks. And to me, I get, when in the scotches, what I think is the sherry cask, at least, is like a really strong fruity note right at the end. I don't get that with this. What I get with this one is more of, there's still a little bit of fruit. It's more general sweetness. And it's got a lot of vanilla, but not the same as bourbon. I mean, the vanilla's coming from the bourbon because it's aged in bourbon casks, as is all Irish. But it's different. It's a different kind of vanilla. I don't know how to describe it, just because I don't have the vocabulary for it. That's part of what I'm attempting to do with this channel personally, is develop a vocabulary for how to describe whiskey. So I don't know. It's almost a desserty, maybe bready sort of vanilla. It's good. I'm enjoying it. I think a bready vanilla is probably the way to go. Maybe like a dessert bread almost. Anyway, Glendalock Double Barrel. It's been on my list for a while. I'm excited that I got it. And currently, on first blush, I'm enjoying it. It's not horrifying to the palate at first. In fact, I think it's rather good. It's already growing on me. I always find, I don't know about you, if you drink whiskey, almost always my first sip of anything, maybe the first sip of the day, but definitely the first time I'm trying a new whiskey, all I get is like ethanol. It just tastes like alcohol at first. I might get a little bit of something else. Isla, you're definitely getting smoke, right? That comes across no matter what. But you let it sit for a little bit, you try it a few more times, and you get more coming out of it. By the way, I do taste just a little bit of the new ones right before. That way, I have something going into it because I'm not good enough at this to just try something brand new. I got to think about it for a little bit. So I do have it just a little bit, enough to give me an idea of what it tastes like. And so the first sip of this, all I got was that ethanol alcohol sort of thing. Now, the more I don't know if it's that it's been in the glass and that kind of has, the vapors have evaporated, I suppose. They've moved off, and now a lot of the good stuff, good flavors of whiskey are actually able to come through more. Or if it's just, when I first taste a whiskey, that's just all I get, and then my palate just kind of goes numb to that, rough alcohol flavor. Not that this was a rough alcohol flavor by any extent. I don't know. I don't know if I'm alone in this sort of experience, but that's what it tends to happen for me, especially with whiskeys I haven't tried before. So, today we're continuing with our Around the Word, and we have another one of these kind of weird weeks where we're jumping around a little bit. If I remember rightly, we were in Exodus 19 through 20, verse 21, because then it just shifts into an explanation of the full covenant law, and it's just not worth reading in this type of reading through the Bible. And then Numbers 11 through 14. And we're starting to see, at least the vast majority of what we hit today, is kind of some of the struggles that the people of Israel were undergoing in between Egypt and the Promised Land. And we're going to talk about that as we go. And of course, we have the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. And in fact, I have really three main things I kind of want to talk about today to one extent or another. The first is about that giving of the law. I don't want to spend a ton of time on this, but I think it is worth pointing out, especially because you get covenant language, right? If you keep this law, then you will receive blessing, right? It's an if-then sort of thing. People have to do something to receive their blessing. And a couple notes on that. One, because that is harsh, particularly to Lutheran ears. That doesn't sound right. So first is that this is a temporal covenant with Israel, so it doesn't apply to us, right? Which is why we're not under the Mosaic covenant and the law. Maybe that'll be a topic for another day. Why we don't have to keep the law, right? So when people attack Christianity, have you seen this, right? By saying, oh, well, you eat lobster, and you shouldn't because in Leviticus it tells you not to do that. Well, that's a foolish argument. There's all sorts of reasons why. Maybe I'll do that on another day. I don't want to talk about it today. It's kind of outside the scope of what I want to do. But it's a temporal covenant. And the second is really the crux of the issue here, is that this covenant isn't given while the Israelites are in Egypt. Have you noticed that? Of course you noticed that, but have you really seen the import, the impact rather, of that? It's not until after God has already delivered his people. His people have already been saved. Then the covenant comes in. And I think that's critical. The timing is very important, right? It wasn't as if God said, if you can keep my covenant for 5 years, then I will deliver you from Egypt. No, they're delivered from Egypt first without proving themselves, and then the covenant is given to them. You could almost say that this is third use of the law kind of stuff, right? Now that you are my people, now that I have saved you from Egypt and brought you out with a mighty hand, now you will live like this. This is how you shall live, now that I've already saved you, right? So the salvation is not dependent on what the people have done. But there's an old covenant, kind of political suzerain vassal, if you want to get technical, sort of thing going on that was a temporary, for one particular moment in time sort of thing. The blessings that are being promised are not the blessings of salvation. They're worldly blessings. And so we don't need to worry about that as far as, do we need to earn our own salvation? No, not what it's talking about at all. So the next thing I want to talk about, I want to kind of skip forward. And kind of take note broadly at the wanderings in the wilderness. First of all, the travel to the Promised Land the first time around, and then the wanderings thereafter. After kind of where our text ended today with the report of the spies and the people refusing to go into the land, and then going in once the consequences had been laid out, um, and God wasn't with him in battle. And we can kind of see that these reports, these stories, these events really are a microcosm of our life, right? And so hear me out on this. The Exodus, we talked in the last one of these videos on Exodus 11 through 15, that the Exodus event is the salvation event. It's one of, and the primary, really, salvation event of the Old Testament. It typifies Christ and his salvation. And so that we fall after the Exodus, just like the people of Israel at this point in the text do, right? They've already been saved. Salvation has been given to them. And yet, they're not in the Promised Land yet. And of course, the Promised Land is, I guess I haven't really covered this, at least in this channel, but suffice it to say here that the Promised Land typifies eternal life, living in the Promised Land with God, which, by the way, will be on earth, not in heaven. That's kind of a general, pretty common misunderstanding that Christians have. New heavens and the new earth, you will have a body, but that's also not a conversation for here. The wanderings in the wilderness are then post-salvation, but pre-life in, eternal life, we'll just say. And that's where we are. That's the age of the church. That's you, and on a very small scale, right? You have already been saved by Christ, but you are still awaiting the final fulfillment, that deliverance into the Promised Land. And we see a lot of Israel's struggles kind of reflected in our lives. Now, they have their own versions of these struggles, right? I don't think any of you are complaining about, the meat pots and leeks of Egypt, right? But the principles at hand, the generalities of the complaints and the wanting for more control, not being content with your station in life, all these sorts of things, we can see in our own lives as well. And let's just talk about one of them. And maybe a little bit of an anecdotal story, I think is what it would be called, of why I chose this particular section. One, because it allowed an easy transition without more numbers, more citations of various readings. I just do it all in one chunk, because I did want to get the report of the spies, because that helps transition us as we go forward. But also, is the story of the birds coming out of the Israelites' nostrils. It has a special place in my heart. When I was a kid, as far as I know, he's still alive. There's an author. His name is Frank Peretti. Wrote some of the earliest books that I remember reading and really, really liking. If you're going to read anything by Frank Peretti, my personal favorite of his is House. He co-wrote it with Ted Dekker. It's Christian suspense, thriller, horror. It's a weird category, but I remember really loving that book. Really enjoyed it. Frank Peretti did kids' materials as well. And in fact, some of the first books I remember reading and enjoying. The Hangman's Curse, and there was one that came after it, but I can't remember the name of the sequel. Frank Peretti wrote those as well, but he did stuff, and that's kind of young adult. He did stuff for little kids as well. I don't remember the exact name of it, but he went by the moniker of Mr. Henry. And I remember distinctly, I would listen to these cassette tapes, because they were cassette tapes. Yes, I'm old enough to remember cassette tapes. I would listen to them on a little boombox speaker thing that I had. It was a cassette tape CD combo. I can still remember it. Listen to these cassettes when I was going to sleep at night, right? had something playing to help you sleep, that sort of thing. And I remember that the cassettes were like various colors, and whenever we got a new one, my brother and I were so excited to listen to them. But one of them, Mr. Henry, covered this story, the story of the Israelites complaining and the birds coming out of their noses. Um, I don't remember many details of how he covered it. There was a tall glass of milk. He had some connection with a tall glass of milk. I don't remember what it was, but it was there. And so this story's always had a place in my heart because I remember it very well. In fact, I know he had a lot of stories that he did. That's the only one that I really remember. I couldn't pick out any other stories in particular, Bible stories that he did on those cassettes. But the birds coming out the Israelites' nose, I do remember. And we see here, right, complaining about God, right, not trusting in God to provide, not even being satisfied with what God already was providing, right? They were getting manna, they were just sick of it, which is astounding in its own right. And how many of us would pay whatever it would be to taste some manna, just to see what it was like? But apparently it was like coriander, so that's interesting enough. Like coriander, there you go. Make bread out of it, and maybe that's what manna tastes like. No idea. By the way, I don't know if you noticed this, but the name manna, this is a side note. It's great. It's Hebrew, obviously. It's two words. I think they call them diglots, where you smush two words together. Ma and na, right? Manna. And it literally just means, what is this? Like, what's this stuff? That's what they called it, because when they woke up on the first day that it was out there, they walked out of their tents and said, "Mana, what is this?" And that's just what they called it. A fun little fact for you. But, and then we see consequences, right? The sin of Israel, lack of trust, being dissatisfied with what God was providing, had real world consequences. In this case, poisoning of the quail, which also, the birds were always coming with the manna. I think we often forget that. It's differently miraculous, right? But the Israelites were not living on manna alone. They were getting quail the whole time. But this time it's more significant because they're being punished for it. But God relents, right? God doesn't wipe them from the face of the earth like he so often says he's planning on doing so, but Moses intervenes. We'll talk about that a little bit. We see the same sort of thing with the serpents, which weren't in our reading. The serpents and the bronze snake on the cross, where Christ directly compares him being lifted up on the cross to the bronze serpent being lifted up. Two anecdotal facts about that one. The serpents are called seraphs. It's just the Hebrew word for venomous snake. But you may recognize that word, that prefix, seraph, because it's the same word for seraphim. Seraph just means fiery, right? So if a venomous snake bites you, it burns, is where we think the term comes from. And the seraphim are fiery beings, and so seraph ends up in both places there. And do you remember this bronze serpent? It shows up outside of the Pentateuch. It shows up in, what would it be, 2 Kings. Hezekiah smashes it to pieces. And he's praised for doing so, right? He gets a credit. It's to Hezekiah's credit that he destroys the bronze serpent, because the people of Israel have made a god out of the thing. It's like you just want to like bang your head into the wall. Like, really, guys, you're always so close and yet so missing the point. And then, of course, that mirror of the law comes up and we realize, we do the same thing. We just don't have the benefit of someone writing it down and being like, "Oh, look at this dumb thing you're doing." But if we're honest with ourselves, we can see ourselves in the Israelites throughout their history. But yeah, the wandering in the wilderness, a microcosm of the Christian life, the life of the believers, because the Israelites were believers. They had a lot of doubts. So do we. But they never stopped being the people of God. Even when God destroyed them in the captivities, they never stopped being God's people. Um, and, and trust me, they did a lot of really awful things. And well, that means that there's some hope for us as well. We too, who are sinners, can trust that while we are capricious, while we wander, God doesn't. Where we are faithless, God is faithful. And where we wander from the fold, God brings us back. We don't stop being his people just because we do stupid things. Good gospel in there as well. So the wanderings is a microcosm of the Christian life. Lastly, I want to talk about the figure of Moses. I got something different when I tasted it there, but I wasn't thinking about it. So I don't know what it was, but something interesting just happened. I don't know what it was because I wasn't paying enough attention. But talk about the person of Moses. Now, I'll be honest, I skimmed at the readings. I put these readings together in December, so I don't remember what they all are. And it's very possible that this section that I'm about to do will fit better next week. But I'm going to do it now anyway, because this is my channel and I can do what I want. So let's talk about the person of Moses. More specifically, well, I guess more circuitously then, let's actually start with the person of Jesus. So we often talk in theological circles about how Christ has a threefold office, which is a fancy way of saying he had three jobs, kind of, or we can see him as having three jobs. He is prophet, priest, and king. And we have Old Testament figures who typify each of these roles. Prophet, we can put one of two individuals in. Moses, but we're going to throw an asterisk on that. We'll table him, although he tends to be the pinnacle there, mostly because of something that's said in Deuteronomy. But Elijah would typify the prophetic role of Christ. Prophet, priest, Aaron would be the priest, or you could also put Melchizedek in there. We didn't talk about Melchizedek. He's in the story of Abraham. Really interesting individual. The priest of Salem, which means peace. It's a variation on shalom, and it's almost certainly Jerusalem before it was Jerusalem, like way before it was Jerusalem. It's not Jerusalem until David. And then with King David is, of course, our typifying individual. And we see that the office is a typological office where just that job in and of itself is pushing us towards Christ and things that the jobs or the offices that he holds, again, for our benefit. So I tabled Moses with prophet because I think he fits. He absolutely fits as prophet. He is the greatest prophet of the Old Testament. I mean, in fact, what I referenced earlier was one of the signs of the Messiah is the first prophet who is greater than Moses is the Messiah, period. That's just, so as soon as a prophet shows up and that prophet is greater than Moses, that's Messiah. That's one of the signs that the ancient people were looking for. And Jesus, of course, fills that role. And so certainly Moses fits there. But the reason I think we'd be better off putting Elijah in that role, even though he's not the greatest prophet of the Old Testament, Elijah, he's a pretty awesome prophet, right? He is close to getting to Moses, but he's not quite there. Is because I think Moses typifies Christ more than anyone else in the Old Testament. Certainly in this sense, right? I guess an argument could be made for David, but I think Moses is probably a better candidate. Insofar as Moses holds all three of those offices. Moses is prophet. Moses is priest, kind of. We'll talk about how he's filling the priestly role, even though Aaron is the high priest. And he's king. I mean, yeah, he's not the regal authority, but he's what the king is supposed to be. We'll talk about all three of those fairly quickly here. So Moses is prophet. He holds the office of prophet. Now, without really doing a deep dive, because you can do very deep dives on what does that mean to be a prophet, let's do a really basic overview. Most people tend to think, and I thought for a very long time, um, not unreasonably, it's how the culture around us uses the term, that the prophets predicted the future. That's what made them prophets. And that's true. The prophets did that. But that was a minor, lesser part of their role. It was, uh, if anything, it was just proof that they were a true prophet from God. In fact, that is one of the one of the not qualifications, one of the litmus tests for whether a prophet was speaking from God or from his own heart, or perhaps hearing from the devil, if you really want to go far, is does what he says come true? Because we know from various scriptures, God never lets his word fall to the ground. If God has spoken a traditionally understood prophetic word through a prophet, it's going to happen, period. You don't get to say, as some people do, right? That you don't get to get it wrong, right? In the Old Testament, if a prophet got it wrong, they died. Now, I'm not advocating that we kill modern day individuals who claim that they're prophets and they get things wrong, which happened like crazy in 2020, because 2020 was a year and a half. My goodness, did a whole bunch of craziness happen that no one saw coming. And all sorts of people who claim to be prophets nowadays just got so much wrong. But what it does mean is we don't need to listen to them. That's the other thing that goes along with this command, is don't be afraid of that individual, because they don't speak for God. So you don't need to worry about them. Ignore them. So if someone claims to be a prophet, check their track record. Because the track record of prophets in the predicting the future camp is 100%, period. We see this playing out with Jeremiah, where he is accused of being a false prophet by some guy whose name I don't know. And Jeremiah says, okay, if I'm a false prophet, whatever he says was going to happen. But if I am a true prophet, that guy's going to be dead by this time next year. And the man dies. The true false prophet, the man accusing Jeremiah ends up dying. And the people for a very brief moment kind of realize, oh, this Jeremiah guy, maybe we should listen to what he says. Of course they don't. I mean, Jeremiah is not called the weeping prophet for nothing. But predicting the future is a really minor part of prophecy. Prophecy, and to speak prophetically in the biblical sense, is to be the mouthpiece of God. Right? And this happens in all sorts of various ways, whether it's visions, hearing things. God, in our reading for this week, talked about how he talks to Moses face to face, and this is the only prophet that he does that with. It's just amazing, right? Well, interestingly enough, there are people out there who claim to speak face to face with God as prophets. We should question that. I mean, regardless of what they're saying, we should just question the fact that they're assuming, that they're claiming that they're at least as great as Moses. That's a big statement. We should be suspicious of that. I was looking for it that time. I didn't get it. Although I'm getting more of the darker fruit sort of thing, like almost like a plum or a blackberry sort of deal going on. I mean, it doesn't taste like fruit. Don't get me wrong. But just something that reminds me of that. Maybe that's what I caught. Anyway, the prophets are simply those people who talk for God, who are his mouthpieces, who speak his words. I mean, look through any of the major or the minor prophets, just be the writing prophets, essentially. Most of what they do is not predicting the future. Again, that happens, but most of what they're doing is simply telling the people what God has to say to them, right? Tell these people, this is my word, right? We see Jonah, who brings that message of repentance. That's a prophetic message. Nothing to do with the future. I mean, yeah, I guess Jonah is saying, if you don't shape up, God will be destroying you. But that's not quite predicting the future, because quite frankly, that doesn't happen, right? Because the people repent, right? So Jonah's not a false prophet, Don't mishear that. But Moses fulfills this role very clearly. He speaks for God. He is the mouthpiece of God. I mean, that's his whole role in Egypt. This is his whole role in the wilderness, the major role in the wilderness. So Moses is prophet. And again, just like Jesus is prophet, right? But Jesus is so much greater in this prophetic sense. Not only is he delivering messages and sermons and he's speaking the words of God, he is the word of God come to people directly. He's not going through prophets anymore. He's coming himself, right? Which is why I think it's Hebrews. It's part of the liturgy, which is why the liturgy is great, right? In many and various ways, God spoke to his people of old, the prophets mostly. But now in these last days, right, these days wandering in the wilderness, he has spoken to us through his Son, who is his word, right? We don't need to go through prophets anymore, right? Because we have straight from the source through Christ. And so Christ definitely exceeds Moses in every sense prophetically. But there we go, Moses in his prophetic office. Moses also fills the priestly office. Again, it's not in the literal sense. This is more of he does the role of the priest. And we can kind of see this in Hebrews, again, a little bit. Now, Hebrews hits on the priestly office of Christ a lot, and it's really good stuff. Stick with the series. I'm pretty sure I have us reading all of Hebrews. I really like Hebrews. That's a great book. But so the one sense is right, offering sacrifices. Hebrews really nails that down. But Hebrews also gets to this other sense of the priestly office, which is a little bit less obvious, but it's the one Moses really typifies. And that is the one who pleads for the people, right? The one who steps in between a furious, righteously so, God and an unrighteous, deserving of damnation people. And Moses is the one who stands in between, right? We see this time and time again where God is ready to be done. I think it's in the golden calf episode where God straight up tells Moses, he says, Moses, go back up Mount Sinai. I'm going to kill all of them and start over with you. Pretty good deal for Moses. And I wonder if he regretted not taking that during some of these later events, because he was still a sinful man. But Moses, of course, intercedes. He says, no, God, don't do it. Have mercy. That's the role Christ plays. That's actually Christ's primary function right now, currently, at this very moment. You wonder, what is Jesus doing this very second? Well, we see in various places, Hebrews being one of them. I think it's in Revelation as well. He's pleading our case before his Father and our Father in heaven. He is interceding on our behalf. It's one of the things he's doing. He's doing some other things too. But we're told that he is, right, standing as mediator. He is standing in between the righteous God and the unrighteous people, pleading on our behalf. And if God relented for Moses, most certainly will he relent for his Son. For the sake of his Son, he relents for us when we fall short as well. So Moses and Jesus both take the office of prophet. They both also take the office of priest, although Moses only takes a partial role as priest. And Moses takes the role of king as well. Again, not in the literal sense. He wasn't a king, but he was the leader of Israel. I think all agree on that. But he did it. He was the best of the kings of Israel. It's a thought I just had, so I don't know if I'm going to backtrack that when I think about it later. But he does what the kings are supposed to do, and David does actually a very good job of it as well. So maybe we don't need to dethrone David. I mean, he was actually a king, but the king's role was not to be a king like the nations. We're gonna talk about that. I can guarantee it. It's absolutely vital to understand the era of the kings and the monarchy is to understand this contrast of the king of Israel and the king like the nation, or at least the contrast that was supposed to be there. But essentially, right, he's not the supreme leader of the land, right? The king of Israel is supposed to be an under king, right? A secondary king. He was supposed to be not quite the figurehead of God on earth, but it's not terribly far off as a way of getting an understanding, right? He was meant to be the one who, yeah, I'm trying not to get too Egypty with, right? The king was not intended to be the physical manifestation of God on earth, right? That's not what I'm talking about. But he was supposed to typify, and I'll use that term, who God was to his people. He was supposed to be under, serving God, right? The king is under God as well. I mean, whether the rulers like it or not, all rulers are under God, right? That's not something that they get to choose one way or the other. But the king of Israel is supposed to realize that. And David very often does. He does mess up a few times. This is what gets Saul kicked out. He tries to make himself the guy in charge. We'll talk about that when we get to Saul. But Moses never has this problem. He is ruling the people, but he never tries to make himself the ruler of the people. He never tries to make himself God unto himself. I'm saying that. I think it's true. But, and again, this is an unpolished channel, you're just getting my thoughts. And it wasn't in the reading, so I feel a little bit better about it. I wonder if there's more of that sort of issue going on with Moses striking the rock for the water, which gets him kicked out of the promised land, essentially. There's always a problem with that, right? Not that he gets punished, right? Fine. But I've always heard it explained as, Moses hit the rock, and God didn't tell him to hit the rock. God told him to hit the rock earlier. I mean, I've never quite been satisfied with that answer of the reason Moses sinned is because he hit the rock with a stick. I'm wondering if there might be. I'm gonna look into this later, and then probably not talk about it on the channel, at least not currently. But I wonder if there's more of that going on. So I might be backtracking at some point my statement that Moses never tries to set himself up as the literal ruler. He always submits to God. He might not. That might actually be more of the real problem going on with the water from the rock. But I didn't read it before this. This is just in my head. So maybe that's a great, tremendous insight I've just had. Or maybe it's just complete nonsense. That's part of the reason why we're doing this. We'll finish off with this bit of overview of the channel and some of the things I'm trying to do here. A lot of what I'm doing on this channel is showing you my process. This is how I do theology in my mind. This is how I work through things. It's a portion of the process, not the whole thing. But this is it, right? There's been something in my mind, in the back of my mind, granted, that has never quite sat right with me. And I know other bits of theology, right? I know about who the king of Israel is supposed to be. And I made this connection that Moses serves this function. So now, maybe, that's what gets Saul kicked out. David has some big problems with that. And that becomes the major issue with the kings. Maybe it's the issue with Moses as well. Because I don't think it would have been a prophetic issue. And maybe, definitely not a priestly issue. Yeah, but maybe he's trying to do his own thing with the message, and the message gets changed. Maybe. But there we go. So I've thought up some ideas. Now, we'll read the text. That's a very critical part, right? Don't just use your own memory. Read the actual text. And then when I think I've got something, then you go and check. Right? And this is what your pastors are for, right? They actually have these resources. If you have them, great. But check and make sure someone else has thought that as well. It's a good general rule for really all disciplines, academic disciplines, especially Christianity and theology. If you're the first person to think something, that's not a good thing. You need to find someone else who's had this similar idea. Doesn't mean you're wrong outright. There have been a lot of smart people over the past 2,000 years. And with Moses, even more than that. see if any of them agree with you. Because if none of them agree with you, none of these incredibly intelligent people, if none of them agree with you, you're probably wrong. So that would be my last step in the process. And then after that, you go from there with implications and all that kind of fun stuff. But there you go. That's a little bit of insight into my process, or how I dig more deeply into a text, dive more and more deeply, eternally into the Word, into theology. But I think we'll end there. And so, all you who wait on the Lord, let's raise a glass and drink to Christ's imminent return, when we'll get to ask these questions for all eternity. Cheers.